Hello students, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on the Cold War. We're going to start with a picture of what occupied Germany looked like. You can see the 4 sections of Germany. The Soviets controlled the eastern section, the French the northern, the British the northwestern, and the United States the southwestern. You can pause this and look at it if you'd like to. We're also going to look at a picture of the Soviet satellite states. What you can see over here are the satellite states, the countries that were under Soviet control and that surrounded the Soviet Union and were part of the Soviet Union. Now, what happened was what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. This was basically an imaginary line that divided Eastern and Western Europe. This occurred when the USSR took control of the Eastern European countries and essentially cut off trade and communications with Western Europe, which was democratic. Now, President Truman had what became known as the Truman Doctrine, and this was essentially the fact that Harry Truman said, the United States will help any country throughout the world fight against communists. We did not want communism to spread. Our policy at the time was known as containment. We wanted to contain communism within its existing borders. 2 early examples of this are the fact that the United States helped both Turkey and Greece to fight against a communist takeover in those countries. Now, Europe was completely devastated because of World War II. So therefore, in 1948, the United States developed what became known as the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe. And they didn't want Europe to break into economic chaos. After World War I, just about all European nations experienced a severe depression, and because their economies were so bad, it allowed the dictators to rise, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler. We didn't want this to happen again. So the Marshall Plan was the U.S. plan to give economic aid to Europe and help them to rebuild after World War II. Now, in 1948, the U.S., French, and British decided to merge each of their occupation zones in Germany and created a country known as West Germany. In response to this, the USSR built the Berlin Wall, preventing travel and communication between East and West Berlin. Now, Berlin had been divided. Berlin, being the capital city of Germany, had been divided into 4 sections as well. So the capital city of Berlin was controlled by each of the 4 countries. The USSR controlled the eastern part of Berlin, and they would cut off the travel between East and West Berlin with this wall. So therefore, the U.S. Conducted what became known as the Berlin Airlift, where we used planes to drop about 2.3 million tons of supplies into the part of Berlin that was cut off. Now, after 15 months, the USSR backed down and lifted the blockade between East and West Berlin. This is a picture of the Berlin Wall, a structure that would later be built, permanently dividing East and West Berlin. Now, in response to the Cold War, the democratic European nations and the United States formed what is known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This included the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations. This was basically a military alliance that all pledged to defend one another. This concept is known as collective security. In other words, there is security and safety in numbers. Now, to counteract this, the Soviets formed what became known as the Warsaw Pact several years later in 1955. This included the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states. Again, this was to counteract NATO. We mentioned the policy of containment. This is the U.S. policy that wanted to keep communism contained in its existing borders. Now, containment is really the reason that we fought both the Korean War and the Vietnam War. In both situations, there were 2 parts of the country, North Korea and South Korea, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. The North was communist, the South was not. The North tried to take over the South. We stepped in to try to stop them. We'll talk more about those wars in the next chapter. In 1949, we had a huge surprise in that China became a communist nation. Mao Zedong was the leader of the communists who defeated the nationalists within China, making China the largest communist nation in the world. The nationalists, by the way, escaped to Taiwan and formed their own country, which is still a country today. Now, this brings us to the Red Scare. If you remember, after World War I, we had a Red Scare. This became known as the First Red Scare. This was a widespread fear that communists were going to take over our government. We had the exact same thing happen after World War II. We had the Second Red Scare. Harry Truman made federal employees take a loyalty oath. In other words, if you worked for the government, you had to take an oath that you were loyal to the United States. Again, this is part of the fear of a communist takeover. People were severely background checked. They were investigated to make sure that they were not communist, and everyone was afraid these communists were going to get into our government. And this ends the second section of our lecture. Thank you for watching.